And here we go looking at kind of a funny cartoon, looking at cranial nerves and plexi, plexuses. We'll talk about what a plexus is in just a second. First, for this cartoon, I'm not going to ask you to memorize the cranial nerves. It seems a little pointless, or to know specifically what they do. We're going to talk about some general functions of cranial nerves in a moment. But this cartoon is really kind of fun to look at because it does show you, based upon cranial nerve number, what a particular cranial nerve does. So if in lab you have to know some more detail, you may want to come back to this picture. What I want to do first is talk about what a nerve actually is. We've been talking about how impulses travel through nerves, and we have afferent and efferent nerves. But in reality, we've been kind of talking more about neurons themselves and not about the nerve. A nerve is a cord-like organ of the peripheral nervous system. And again, you think about organs being things like hearts and lungs, but an organ by definition has multiple tissue types, and a nerve does. You're going to find myelinated and unmyelinated peripheral neurons enclosed by a connective tissue. So when we look at a picture of this, and we look at this this photograph, it may be a little unclear what you're seeing, but these individual nerve fibers in here are actually the axons that are wrapped by an endoneurium. Okay, a group of these nerve fibers, each of which is surrounded by an endoneurium, a connective tissue. A group of those is called a fascicle, and a fascicle is surrounded by a connective tissue called a perineurium. And then all of the fascicles together are wrapped in a epineurium, which is another kind of connective tissue, sort of a sheath that surrounds it all. And of course in here we're going to find blood vessels. And wait a minute, endo, para, and epi, we've seen these before, right? Endomysium, paramysium, and epimysium. Exact same thing. We have connective tissue surrounding individual neurons and then around groups of neurons, and then the whole thing is surrounded and enclosing things like blood vessels. So a nerve is an organ because it has multiple tissue types. Just in this, you're seeing obviously blood vessels, which are connective. You're seeing other kind of connective tissue. You're seeing neurons. There's going to be some other tissue types you really don't see shown here, but it gives you the idea that it's actually somewhat similar in basic organization to a muscle. So let's take a look then at the cranial nerves, and again, you're going to probably get very little detail in this presentation of it. I don't think it's very productive to memorize what all the cranial nerves do, but we're going to look at them kind of an overview. First, what are cranial nerves? These are nerves that are peripheral, so even though we say cranial, they're not part of the CNS. They are still peripheral, that come directly from the brain. The other peripheral nerves that we have been talking about will come from the spinal cord, so these are different. So of these 12 pairs, 10 of these come off of the brainstem, the other 2 come from the cerebrum. And again, you see them here, you'll see a better view in just a second. And when we consider what these things do, we have functions for each of these, of course, but we number them. Cranial nerve 1 is the most anterior, and then cranial nerve 12 is the most posterior, or the most caudal. So when you see facial nerve 7, like you see here, we do number them in the order that they arise from the brain itself. These will pass through the cranial foramina. They will actually pass through the openings of the skull, of the cranium in particular, and these basically are going to handle mostly functions around the head and the neck. There is one in particular that wanders, and maybe that helps you know what it is if you know this term. There's one that actually is going to be descending into the abdomen. And again, these are peripheral. Most of these cranial nerves are mixed, which means they contain both motor functions and sensory functions. 2 of these, the olfactory 1 and optic nerve 2, these are purely sensory, but most everything else has a motor and a sensory function. or it has at least everything else 3 through 12 has for sure a sensory function, but only a couple have purely sensory functions. So why do I even mention that? When we want to assess cranial nerves, we need to know obviously what they do, because the test that we will use to determine whether or not they're healthy will depend upon if it has motor functions. Can a person do a particular function? If it's sensory, can they sense a particular stimulus? So this is just a blown up version of it. And again, whenever we refer to the cranial nerves, we always refer to the name and the number. Don't say olfactory nerve. It's olfactory nerve 1, or optic nerve 2, or hypoglossal nerve 12. That's just the convention we have in anatomy. So I don't want you to go through and try to learn this in a lot of detail. I think it is helpful to associate certain cranial nerves with certain functions so that you begin to at least understand when you see these things assessed what they're assessing. So you may want to pause the video at some point and look at this chart and spend some time with it. I would encourage you to read through it just to see what a cranial nerve does and how it's assessed. We'll take just a second and talk about a couple of these. For example, you see cranial nerves here 3, 4, and 6, oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens. These all are involving an eyeball movement. So if we suspect someone has an injury to one of these cranial nerves, we're going to ask them to do particular functions, like the whole test of following your finger with your eye is one way of actually assessing these. If your eye, the abducens, for example, actually abducts your eye, it moves your eyeball that direction. So if somebody cannot move their eye that direction following some kind of head trauma or tumor, we may suspect injury to that cranial nerve. Again, some of these, as we said before, are purely sensory, like you see with olfactory 1 and optic 2. Vestibulocochlear has a little bit of motor function. I just didn't add it here. But most everywhere else you will see the motor and sensory functions. One I mentioned in particular here is the facial nerve. And let me show you this. This is kind of a cool way of remembering the 5 branches of the facial nerve. You've no doubt been to the dentist and probably had to have a shot, have a cavity filled. Well, if they're trying to give you a numbing action in your lower jaw, then the dentist is going to put a shot into a branch of your mandibular nerve, which is actually a branch of your facial nerve. If you have an upper, your upper teeth need to be fixed, then they're going to hit the buccal nerve. But this is kind of a cool way of looking at the 5 branches of the facial nerve. The last ones, of course, we have glossopharyngeal and vagus. Vagus is the wanderer. Vagus nerve 10 is the one that actually extends into the abdomen, and it's really, really important for a lot of our visceral functions, and we'll talk about that more in the autonomic nervous system. And then you see accessory and hypoglossal, who have hypoglossal in particular deals with articulation. So if somebody cannot articulate very well, then that might actually be an indication of some hypoglossal damage. Just to give you an idea of how some of these things manifest themselves as pathologies, you've probably heard of Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy is when you have paralysis on one side of your face. This is because the facial nerve comes to a very small opening near your temporal lobe, and that area can become infected, particularly by Lyme disease. And it inflames that area, so it kind of constricts that nerve, and then that results in paralysis on one side of the face. So in this woman here, this side of the face is fine. This side that looks kind of blank, if you will, is because of paralysis of the facial nerve. What we have here, we have this guy is trying to look this direction, but this eye is not moving. So you have an issue here with a abducens and eyeball, abducens 3, and here you have an issue with abducens is not 3, oculomotor in this case. Again, one of the things we see with this particular cranial nerve is the drooping of the eye. So I just show you these, so if you ever see this in clinical and someone's asking someone to go through these tests or trying to assess the health of, the functionality of the cranial nerves. If you wanted to remember these, how do you do it? There's a number of mnemonics. This is the one that one of our books has used that people kind of like. One that's a little more off color is here if you wanted to one. Sometimes people remember the dirty ones better than they remember the ones that are clean. So again, you may want to go through and learn a mnemonic so that you know the order of the cranial nerves. I'm not going to ask you any detailed questions about the cranial nerves, like trying to say what does the hypoglossal nerve do, but it's helpful to read through that list just so you understand what these things do and the variety of the functions that they carry out. The last thing I want to mention in this video is talk just a little bit about plexus, plexi plural. I've kind of led you to believe, and I think most people believe, that a peripheral nerve is going to come off from the spinal cord, and that one nerve does one particular thing all the way until it gets to your little finger. In reality, we have branching networks of nerves called a plexus. So let me move for a second here. So here you have, coming off the spinal cord, you have C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. This actually is making up what's called the brachial plexus, and you see it over here. The brachial plexus shows where C5 and C6 are going to, these two primarily are going to form the lateral cord, which is going to become a part of your median nerve, as well as C8 and T1 form the medial cord to form part of the median nerve. So it's not as if a single nerve comes off the spinal cord and forms a median nerve or an ulnar nerve. Generally speaking, you're going to have multiple of these roots form trunks. The trunks have divisions, and the divisions have cords, and the cords form nerves. It's a kind of complicated anatomical structure, but I'm not asking you to memorize that, the roots and trunks and divisions and cords in any detail, but to understand that nerves form these networks, and these networks ultimately produce nerves that are combinations of the spinal nerves. So these are afferent and efferent, and so as information is traveling to and from, for example, if we're talking about the ulnar nerve is not simply one spinal nerve that branched. It's going to be a combination of these that arise from the spinal cord. What you see over here just shows you the major plexi. We have cervical, brachial, lumbosacral. What you don't see up here is one that's really thoracic, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the autonomic nervous system. There are some other autonomic plexi that you're not seeing here, but I want you to see the major plexi in this diagram. The other thing that I want to mention that's of some significance is when somebody has injuries to a plexus. So let me go back. So if somebody suffers an injury where they get stretched, where their head and their shoulder kind of go opposite directions, you may have heard the expression that someone has a burner. This is typically what we're talking about, is that there's going to be a stretching of that nerve and therefore some pretty intense sensations from it. So any kind of lateral movement of the head that kind of pulls the head away is going to potentially damage that plexus here, the brachial plexus. This also can be a pretty serious complication of childbirth. Here you see damage to the brachial plexus. That arm may have come out first and was pulled on, and you have separation of the head from the shoulder, and that can actually lead to denervation of that arm. So it is a pretty serious issue that if you damage the plexus, you're not damaging a single nerve. You could be damaging multiple nerves with quite a bit of consequence. So I just want to give you that sense of what a nerve was, what cranial nerves are in general, and at least understand that when we're talking about peripheral nerves with a plexus, that a single spinal nerve is not it. It's a branching network of nerves that ultimately gives us the nerves we associate with our femoral nerve or ulnar nerve or radial nerve. That's it for this video. Thank you very much.